performance evaluation. And very crucially, the composition of funding for the university sector has changed in at least two directions. First of all, there has been a general shrinking of public funding for academic research and education, spurring universities to compensate by identifying private sources of income that they could tap into. One of them is students' tuition fees, but there's also income from engaging with businesses, for example. Also, there have been changes in the allocation mechanism for public funding, so the more and more universities are receiving funding on the basis of performance evaluation mechanisms, and we know that in the UK this is now affecting all the missions of the universities. We have the REF, the TEF, the KEF, so, well, the KEF is not a funding allocation mechanism, but there are other funding mechanisms for knowledge exchange which are also performance based. So there have been changes, and interestingly, the effect of changes in universities' funding sources have been investigated in relation to research and teaching to a much greater extent than they have been investigated in relation to universities' knowledge exchange. So we don't really know that much about the implication of universities and relying increasingly on private funding on the nature of their knowledge exchange activities and the extent to which they engage in knowledge exchange. So, when we invited the panel, we suggested that key questions for discussions could be: to what extent are private sources of funding becoming more important for universities? Are there differences between universities? Does increasing reliance on private funding affect universities' engagement with industries and other industry and other external stakeholders? What is a good balance between public and private funding for universities, and how can it be achieved? So these are the themes that we hope we'll be able to discuss a little bit in the context of this panel. I'm going to give a brief introduction of the speakers in order of presentation. So the first speaker will be Dr. Abhijit Sengupta, who will talk about the impact of changes in university funding on knowledge exchange profile, a study of UK universities. Abhijit is a reader in business analytics at Surrey Business School, University of Surrey. He works in innovation and technology management, global strategy, and complex system modeling. The second speaker will be Dr. Andrea Filippetti, who will talk about the economic nature of knowledge, or why do we need public research. Andrea is a research director at the National Research Council of Italy, and is also a fellow here at the Bergweg Center for Innovation Management Research, of which we're delighted, of course. He is interested in the institution and political economy of decentralization, innovation, and the globalization of intellectual property rights, as well as technological change and productivity growth. Finally, our third panelist will be Dr. Alex Scheiks, who will present his view on changes in funding and changes in approaches taken by university sector towards knowledge exchange. Alex is the head of commercialization UK Research and Innovation UK RI. In his role, Alex contributes to the development of innovative models and approaches to address barriers to the successful translation and commercialization of research outputs. He has a PhD in fundamental genetics from the University of Leicester, and he has a specific interest on new ventures creation. So I am leaving the floor to the speakers, and I would like to kindly ask the speaker to speak for no longer than 10 minutes, after which we will have some questions from the audience. So thank you, Abhijit, I leave the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Federica. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you everyone for joining this session, which I'm co-organizing with Federica. Let me just start by sharing my slides. Hopefully they will start to appear shortly. Okay. All right. So hope you can see this, the first slide, and I will, let me just start right away. So basically what I'm going to do is talk very briefly about this one paper that I have with Federica, which is part of a slightly larger project, which was funded originally by the Studies in Higher Education, the Society for Research in Higher Education in the UK. Although the impact of changes in funding in universities impacts teaching, research, knowledge exchange, everything. So the bit that we are going to concentrate for this particular talk is to look at knowledge exchange. And what we are going to see is basically how with changes in the funding portfolio of universities, what impact it has down the line on university knowledge exchange, particularly in terms of how they are willing to diversify or specialize in the kind of channels they use for knowledge exchange, as well as the kind of stakeholders that they actually engage with. So let me go into the first slide. Um, as we know that the third mission, which Federica had just mentioned, is becoming strategically and financially important for universities, not just in the UK, but the world over. And one of the primary reasons has been the way policy has impacted universities. So public funding for universities has been cut short or is reducing. There is performance-related funding, which Federica mentioned. And at the same time, private sources of income is becoming relatively more important. Okay, and the other phenomenon that we generally are getting to see in the UK or in the US and in many other places is that most of the public funding that is coming in, as well as the private funding, is concentrated at the top tier universities. So the big universities, the older universities, the more research intensive universities, this is where most of the funding is getting concentrated. So a rich getting richer kind of phenomenon is taking place. So the kind of questions we wanted to address in this paper is, as universities themselves are seeing an increased importance of knowledge exchange in their financial portfolio, what kind of impact is it having on the channels that they engage with and channels that they engage in, as well as the stakeholders that they engage with? And is there variation in the impact that this impact takes place between universities? So does heterogeneity among universities actually impact the kind of impact that the kind of effect that we're talking about between funding and knowledge exchange? So very briefly, I'm going to go over a little bit of the theoretical structure that we're coming from. We are going to, the way we have addressed this in the paper is to use what we call dynamic capabilities, a well-known paradigm, theoretical fact paradigm in strategic management literature, where, as most of you would probably know, is that it looks into the way organizations react or are willing to react and reconfigure the resources as and when their external environment changes. And this kind of reaction can take in the form of reconfiguration and reintegration of newly developed capabilities, which they have developed as in response to changes in the external environment, or in the form of leveraging and learning from existing capabilities. So what we are trying to say here, and what we're trying to get to here, is that in case of universities, as and when the knowledge exchange portfolio becomes more and more important financially, we would see that they are engaging more with leveraging and learning. That is, they are going into area, they are not going into new areas, but they're rather trying to do whatever they did previously better and more efficiently. So they basically try and specialize in those things that they have been good at previously. But on the other hand, if they see that their research income or the share of research income is becoming more important over time in their financial portfolio, that encourages them to go and develop new capabilities and reconfigure the resources to bring in and carry out newer kind of activities. So what we are trying to hypothesize, and this is stated more explicitly in the next slide, is that as KE income becomes more important, they specialize in their KE activities more and more, whereas if research income, on the other hand, becomes a bit more important, we see a diversification in the KE portfolios. These are the first two hypotheses that we are going to test here, and we think that this is something important, both not just for us as researchers, but also for university managers to take account of, as well as the public policy maker who is sort of incentivizing universities to look for new kinds of funding. But the third and the fourth hypothesis state that this impact that we are trying to posit in terms of income, K income having an impact on the diversification of KE portfolio and research income having an impact on the diversification of the KE portfolio. These movements are sort of diluted as the resources of the universities become bigger, or in that, but this is a bit more in the cross-section sense. That means that if those universities which are larger, which have more tangible and intangible resources in hand, for them, these movements or these reactions become weaker. Whereas for universities which are in the medium or lower end in terms of resources that they are more reactive. They try to react, they are seen to react a bit more readily to changes in their income portfolio. So these are the kind of hypotheses that we are trying to test and sort of capture in the figure that we have here. Now, I'm going to very briefly go over the context and the data. The context is the UK. We are looking at 110 universities in the UK, starting from 2008-9 to 2015-16. So we are using a panel data of 8 years, and this panel data is a well-known higher education BCI, business and community interaction panel data set, the HEPC data set, and we complement it with our own data, collected data from the Higher Education Statistical Agency in the UK. Now, when I talk about channels in this talk, KE channels or knowledge exchange channels, we mean the various ways that universities use to engage with the private sector or any other external stakeholder. So things like contract research, collaborations, consultancies, commercialization in the form of patents and spin-outs, CE and CPD kind of interactions, as well as local and regeneration grants. So all these different channels that they use. Whereas the stakeholders, when we refer to stakeholders, I'm talking about whether they're SMEs, larger firms, or non-commercial firms. Okay. In terms of tangible resources, which we use as the moderator, or one of the ways which we sort of differentiate between universities, is the total income of the universities. So we differentiate between larger universities in terms of income versus smaller universities in terms of income. We also resources, we measure it in terms of breadth of research. So universities which cover a large, wide variety of disciplines in their research versus which are a bit more narrower and more focused. Now, the empirical strategies, we use typical lagged fixed effects Tobit model for panel data analysis. Our dependent variables are basically the indices of diversification that we compute, the well-known Herfindahl index, and both for channels as for stakeholders. And our independent variables are what we hypothesize on the income share of knowledge exchange and income share of research. And we use various different robustness strategies, which I'm not going to go into detail at this point. So a very brief overview of the kind of sector that we're looking at in terms of both the diversification indices and the income shares. So I don't think I have the time to go into this table in detail, but I mean, the paper is available from us if you want to, and it gives you a very good idea of how universities are diversified in terms of the channels that they use for engaging, as well as the stakeholders that they engage with, as well as the various income shares that they have. In terms of findings, I think I just have over a minute left. In findings, and this is where we should be spending more, putting in a bit of effort to understand, is that we are able to verify both hypothesis 1 and 2. That is, we see that as KE income share goes up, the diversification index decreases. That means universities are more specialized, become more specialized over time in terms of the kind of channels that they use. On the other hand, when research income goes up in comparison, you see a greater diversification in the KE channels that they use. And we are also able to verify to a large extent both hypothesis 3 and 4, where we say that a broader amount of intangible resources, a broader research base, actually weakens both these primary relationships, which I just spoke about for hypothesis 1 and 2. That is, the universities which are bigger which have a bigger research base will not be so reactive as universities which are smaller or narrower in focus when it comes to research base. Okay, so this is something which is verified. Whereas hypothesis 4, where we look at the moderation impact in terms of tangible resources, which is measured through total income, we don't see this impact to the full extent. We don't see this weakening to the full extent. We only see the weakening in one part of the relationship, where once research income goes up, the diversification index goes up as well, but this impact becomes weaker for income for universities which are of higher income, whereas the weakening is not seen in the knowledge exchange in the case of hypothesis 1, where we are looking at the relationship between knowledge exchange and the diversification indices. So if I just go back to the original figure, what we do see is that these two primary hypothesis relationships hold, also that these two primary hypotheses get weakened to a large extent for universities which are in possession of larger amount of intangible resources and to some extent tangible resources. So these are our main results. And I just wanted to put up the last slide for discussion, which we can have as part of the panel, is what does it imply? So what do these results actually imply? So what we see is that universities which are not that resource rich react to the kind of portfolio that they generate in both in terms of knowledge exchange income and research income. Okay, and it influences both the kind of channels that they use and the kind of stakeholders they engage with in terms of how much or how diversified they are. Okay, so that's the basic finding. But in terms of implications on universities, what this results imply is that if you have policies which put or encourage importance of private income sources, which results in K income becoming a bit more important in the financial portfolio, results in universities moving towards a more specialized, becoming more specialized and less risk-taking. Now, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is open for discussion. And in terms of the whole sector, what we see is that if the university sector or the higher education sector is extremely homogeneous, that the universities are pretty similar, then the sector will move in such directions, and it will result in basically crowding out of a set of channels and stakeholders, because all universities will start to become more specialized, and if they are of similar nature, they will specialize in the same direction. So these are implications both for universities and for the sector as a whole, which I think is important, not just for universities themselves, but also for funders. And this is where Alex can probably come in and talk about what this implies for them, being one of those funders. But this is what we have as so far as this paper is concerned. So I'm going to stop here. So thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, or Federica, if you want to move to the next speaker.
Thank you, Abhijit. I'm going to leave the floor to Andrea now. I forgot to say that because this is a panel and we don't have a huge amount of time, we will leave questions for the end. So in the meantime, if any of the participants have any questions, they are welcome to write them in the chat. And if the questions are directed to the particular speaker, perhaps note it, and then we will take these questions at the end. Okay? So Andrea, please feel free to show your slides and take.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, can you see the slides as well?
We can see the slides as well.
Okay, so thank you, Federica. Thanks for the invitation. It's always very nice to be back at BreakBack. Well, I'm also going to talk about a paper that we wrote some years ago with Daniele, which is about the nature of knowledge, which in a sense makes a little bit step behind what we've been talking about, because it really considers on a very aggregate level what are the main differences between, when research is financed by the private sector rather than the public sector, and then what are the implications. But let me start by this. Okay, I need this chart to as a background, because, well, these are figures from OECD countries. These are weighted for research and development expenditure, and what they show are the share of GDP which is devoted to research and development divided by public and research by 1981 until recently. So this is where we start from. I mean, what you observe, whatever you take these kind of figures, is that there's been basically a shift, a considerable shift from the public sector to the private sector when it comes to financing research and development. So, a starting point, we take stock of this fact. Okay, so more and more research has shifted from the public to the business sector, and therefore the question is whether does it make any difference in the first place, and second, are there implications, for example, in terms for the society, so for development, for technological development, economic growth, and so on and so forth. Okay, so and to make a long story short, the answer is to us was yes. We made two arguments. The first is that there are considerable differences between knowledge generated in the public sector and the private sector. They do differ, and they differ in economic terms. Okay, so we're not talking about the generation of knowledge per se. We are talking about the economic characteristics, the economic features of knowledge when it is produced in the private sector rather than in the public sector. And the second argument is that, well, starting from these differences, considering these differences, there are implications. There are implications in terms of welfare that we discuss in the paper. So, if you think of, I mean, if you go back to the theories of knowledge generation and funding, I mean, the role of public sector in R&D, the problem has always been in terms of the production, the generation of knowledge. So you need institutions, you need a public sector, you need an arrangement to have the optimal level in the production of knowledge, okay? But less attention was devoted to the problem of the diffusion of knowledge, okay? And the idea is that, well, if you consider that knowledge is a public good, once you have generated knowledge, the diffusion will come as a consequence, okay? Just because of the nature of knowledge as a public good itself. So if you start from conceptualizing knowledge as a public good, you don't need to care about who will generate knowledge, okay? It will always be available for everybody, since thanks to its characteristics of non-excludability and non-rivalry, okay? Well, our arguments, I mean, we start from innovation studies background, which is at least a bit less, let's say, naive about the public good nature of knowledge. It is a bit more, it complicates the story a little bit, but the end is that knowledge is, in fact, a quasi-public good, and therefore there are differences in the nature of knowledge, which in turn provide differences for the diffusion of knowledge. So those are the main differences between, I mean, I'm summarizing here, but the main differences between private generated knowledge and public generated knowledge, okay? So these differences are, again, all economic in nature, okay? So let's start from the allocation of resources. So how, what is the criteria according to which resources get allocated in the private sector doing research? Well, of course, as we know, it's quite straightforward. Private companies allocate funding looking for profits, looking for financial returns, looking for creating value for their stakeholders. So, I mean, if you want to exaggerate, you don't have to blame them when, as it happened a few months ago, they would stop doing research in some rare disease, and they started doing research in some cosmetics, for example. Okay, you cannot blame them. They're looking for profits. They have a mandate from their stakeholders. They're just maximizing their expected returns. So the allocation of resources in the private sector when it comes to research respond to market logic. Okay, but on the public sector, you have a completely different story. The resources get allocated through, in the first place, to a political process. Okay, we can think of basic research. We can think of the Apollo mission. Now there's a lot of talking about mission-oriented innovation. In all these cases, you see that the governments set the objectives. The government sets the strategies. So, and therefore, the governments would allocate resources accordingly. Okay, so the governments eventually respond to citizens. So, in a sense, there's a social process behind the allocation of resources in the public sector. And the other big difference here, I'm just rushing a little bit, is about excludability. Okay, and therefore, of course, with important implications for the diffusion of knowledge. So, in the private sector, what companies do, and again, it is sensible, they respond to market competition. What they do, they try as much as possible to keep knowledge secret. The more valuable knowledge, the more the tacitness of knowledge, the more they will make efforts, they will spend resources to keep it secret. There are trade secrets, and then of course there is all this big effort and financial effort about intellectual property rights. Okay, so what companies do, they try to make knowledge excludable as much as they can. Okay, and actually put resources, financial resources on it. Well, the contrary takes place in the public sector, where you have all these programs of transfer of technologies, and also individual incentives of scientists. I'm simplifying here, but the individual incentive of scientists are there of making knowledge public, circulating as fast as and as much as possible. So scientists, they want to have their papers out. They want to have the results out in the headlines of newspapers or big journals, because that would increase their standing and eventually they will push their career. So there are the structure of incentives regarding the diffusion of knowledge is the opposite if you think about the private sector and if you think about the public sector. And of course, this has huge implications in terms of the diffusion of knowledge. So you see, what we have here is not that, when you start considering the economic environment in which knowledge gets produced, you can highlight a number of relevant differences with enormous implications in terms of the diffusion of knowledge to the society, and therefore implications for future innovation, technological change, and reusability of knowledge, recombination of knowledge, and so on and so forth. Okay. If I have a couple of minutes left, well, of course, it's not just public and private. It's not just black and white. It's a bit more complicated. And actually, you can think of research and development from the standpoint of who is going to put the money, public sector or the business sector, but also where R&D activity will take place. So the sector of performance. Okay. Now, if you look at this 2x2 matrix, well, here, quadrant number 1 is the public sector, which is financing research in the public sector. So this is pretty much a pure public goals, if you want, but it is, I mean, basic research, universities, research centers, and so on and so forth. If you look at this quadrant here, number 4, it is research which is financed by the business, within the companies, and this is, you know, business R&D as we know it. So here on this diagonal we have these two models that we have highlighted before, in which knowledge, the generation of knowledge respond to different incentives, different strategies, and therefore with different implications in terms of diffusion of knowledge into the society. But then you also have this diagonal here, which is there are two hybrid types of collaborations between the public and private sector, which, I mean, one of which goes back to what the speaker Abhijit was arguing before. Okay, so when the business is financing R&D in the public sector, we have the kind of mechanism that was previously shown in the paper, but also we have a lot of cases in which the public here is financing research in the business sector, and this is typical procurement. Okay, so in these two quadrants you have a mix of public and private incentives with characteristics which are a bit hybrid. So here it is the business sector which decides the allocation of money, the resources, so the business sector has the lead, while here in the public, which makes, you know, procurement in the business sector, you have the public sector which is responsible for the allocation of resources. So here you have some mixed mechanisms which, I mean, in which the model works something different, something less clear-cut. But I mean, when you look at the figures, so when you populate these two kind of tables, those figures are OECD countries' average. So what this is telling us is that 1981, 35% of research was financed by the public sector and performed within the public sector. By contrast, 52%, nearly 53%, was financed by the business sector and carried out within companies. Okay, so as you can see, the main diagonal is of course much more important, but you can also see a non-negligible figure here in which the public sector is contracting out, is making, you know, use of procurement to contracting out research into the business sector. Okay. Now, if you make the same exercise for 2012, yeah, data are a bit outdated now, but what you see is that, well, the main diagonal is still very important, but, you know, the business kind of model has increased its importance. But interestingly enough, on this diagonal, these two hybrid types of collaboration, which the public and the private get intertwined, where they collaborate, it's rather less relevant. So here you have all this, you know, literature about, you know, triple helix and knowledge transfer, collaboration, so on and so forth. But you see that when actually you see the figures, you know, how much it counts, it does not arise, you know, as so important. So what these figures would tell us is that the two prevalent model of knowledge generation are still the, you know, pure public and the pure private, but with, you know, with a greater emphasis, greater importance, and, you know, higher amount of resources, which has been shifted from the public sector to the business sector. And, you know, according to us, and according to the differences in the economic nature of knowledge, and most importantly, to the differences that they have in terms of the diffusion of knowledge, these is going to, I mean, this is expected to bear important consequences, implications for welfare, innovation, and economic growth. I think I'm finished here. There's a paper for those who want to take a look at it.
Thank you very much, Andrea. This was very interesting and also thought-provoking and interesting. When you look at the figures behind the rhetoric, it's always very illuminating. Thank you very much. So I think we've had two presentations where the speakers have discussed the effects of funding, changes in funding on two different things, on the universities' strategies for knowledge exchange and on the incentives for knowledge production and dissemination. I would like now to invite our third speaker, Alex Chikes from UKRI, to give some comments and his views on these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federica. So good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Alex Chikes. I work for UK Research Innovation, which is one of the main big funder of research in the UK. And I am currently head of commercialization, so very much focused on how output of research, either funded through Research England, Research Council, or Innovate UK, can make their way to the market, if you like. So first of all, so thank you very much to Abhijit to the invitation to speak. I think it's fair to say that in the last year, I've been working from home in my kitchen, having less opportunity to engage and to visit places. So I'm delighted to join you. However, I'll give you a disclaimer, is although I'm working for UKRI, I'm not here to present any policies or things that UKRI might do or not do. So I'm here more in a personal capacity as a practitioner, if you like, of someone who works at the interface between university, knowledge exchange, and policy making. So I actually probably the only one out in this panel session, considering, well, I do have a doctorate. This one is in genetics. So I don't study and don't pretend to understand in the level of detail that Andrea and Abhijit do innovation ecosystems and businesses and so like. However, I've trained as a tech transfer and I then move on to managing a small KE office and looking at what asset the university had and how could we utilize those assets for the greater good while still generating some revenue. So I think that I'll share some of my perspective on that. And more recently, obviously, so I've joined then after that a research council and then now UK Research and Innovation. So I do have a perspective from the funder's point of view, and I can expand on some of the things that are currently happening in the innovation ecosystem. So I hope that makes sense. That's a disclaimer for me. So I'm not actually going to, yeah. Whatever I say is not necessarily UKRI policy. That's what I'm saying. So interestingly, I was really taken by both talks actually, and my interest is in understanding exactly what that might mean, and that's what it means when looking to support knowledge exchange, knowledge transfer, and in my own perspective, the commercialization of research, if you like. And so the interplay and how university might adapt to the changing policy and funding landscape, as well as where the funds are channeled and what might happen to the dissemination of knowledge. It's fair to say that, especially in the UK, but I think it's true to other countries as well, including Germany and the US, the concentration of research is prominent, and not every single institution is funded the same. I mean, to give you an example, if we look at qualitative research, which is one aspect of the funding of university in the dual support system in the UK, 40% of the QR allocation of 1.6 billion goes to 6 universities. So it's 40% already concentrated in QR. And so therefore, that concentration of the qualitative research element is also reflected in how university attracts the other side of the dual support system, which is the most project-driven, research-driven by Research Council. And so we know that from our point of view. This is also predominantly articulated around large population area where there is large universities and so on and so forth. So I think it's a complex system, and but actually there is a part of success attracting success in some respect, and that has impact on the type of knowledge exchange that some of those universities do. So if we look at the EPSI return notably, and the commercialization aspect in terms of exploitation of intellectual property generated by university, the most financial return is actually in exploitation of IP is generating by 6 large institutions overall. So there is exploitation in other part, but it's not as prominent as what those 6 universities do. So actually that also reflects that funnel and that trend. It's interesting. I was taken once by at a conference by the chair of the AUTM, the University Tech Transfer Association in the US, who visiting university around the US was told everywhere that everybody wanted to be like MIT in terms of revenue generating through licenses and spin out and so on. But his comment was always, okay, that's great. That's a great ambition to have. But do you have $1 billion of research investment? Because that's exactly what MIT does. So one should see the output of knowledge generation as a direct correlation to the input, actually, which will be my point. So that is important because I think we need to consider when talking about knowledge exchange, knowledge absorption, what universities do, the fact that you can only do knowledge exchange on the knowledge that you have or the knowledge you generate and the type of asset that you have. So there's a very strong correlation between the type of knowledge exchange that you do, the type of activity that you run, and the type of knowledge generation disciplines and assets and so on that you have. So I've seen already some question in the chat, and I will echo those ones, is that while the research by Abhijit and Andrea is really interesting, is one of the things that strikes me is, do we need to look at a level down in terms of discipline, for example, in understanding that? Could be very useful. So nonetheless, I mean, saying all this, we in UKRI, but also especially in my team, but also across government, have seen a resurgence and an interest in making sure that research is funded, but can lead to a difference, and or in some cases, and in our cases, is funded with a purpose in mind. And I think that's where maybe further discussion is needed with what Andrea highlighted in terms of the different type of knowledge generation by business and by the public sector. In the public sector, increasingly, well, we have to demonstrate how that investment is going to make a difference. And increasingly, we have to demonstrate how we evaluate how that difference will happen, actually. And it's all the business case that we are developing in terms of comprehensive spending review or any others, that has to be paramount. So there is a shift towards understanding what difference public investment in research will make over the longer term. And although I'm head of commercialization, I always say we need to be mindful when talking about the commercialization of research, notably, and that commercialization is not an end in itself, but is actually a mean to an end. So what I mean by that is that sometimes when wanting to realize the broader impact possible, one needs to consider a commercial route in order to change the most people's life. And I mean, some example of that are actually very current, with obviously the emergence of different vaccines, which has required bringing together university research and companies' knowledge, notably in manufacturing and so on and so forth. So I think that's a very good example of that. We obviously there is an increased focus in government in making sure that we lead a kind of a COVID recovery through research. Government is still committed to its 2.4% investment GDP in research, and obviously that requires not only the public sector but also businesses to take part and companies to take part. So so that's where we come in UKRI in trying to facilitate how the knowledge generation can contribute to not only the social development but also the economic recovery. So and so we'll try to find ways of actually doing that, and that's where I was really interested in first of all taking part in this conversation, and that's why I haven't got any slides, because I'd rather talk to you, and in understanding how or what measure should one take can actually skew the system, and making sure that we do that for the greater good and the better benefit. So what could be the innovative effect of injecting more money into the KE system, for example, and the specialization is one which is of great interest to me. I'm not sure how much time that I have, but if we were to stop at 2 p.m. UK time, that probably leaves us 10 minutes to questions, so I'll probably stop here, and I hope that's been enough.
Thank you very much. That's perfect timing, actually. We have 10 minutes. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to, since we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to group a couple of questions that have been put in the chat, and I'm going to put them to you, and then you can address them in the order. So first of all, Mutu was suggesting that what is interesting is not just the combination of funding and performers, but the hybrid combination of public funding, private performance, and vice versa, but actually situations where public and private actors are working together with public funding. So is this something that we can observe in the data, and what role could it have for knowledge development? We then have a question from Ben Youngblood, and you probably read in it as well, but this is a question about not just the nature of funding, but also the way in which the funding is given. So should we look at the effects of competitive performance-based funding? What are the implications of the way in which funding happens for knowledge exchange? Sorry, I'm paraphrasing. And third of all, there is a question from Grazia about changes in the nature of research. So are these changes in funding having implications for the nature of the research that is being performed? Grazia is asking particularly of Andrea. So if the speakers would like to reflect on this, you are free to address all 3 points, or just pick 1 or 2 of them if you prefer. Abhijit, would you like to comment on these questions?
Okay, thank you for the questions. I think I've already started addressing a couple of them on the chat itself. I should have actually held on until the end. But anyway, so I'll start off with the question by Ben. Yes, you're absolutely right. We do aggregate the funding when it comes to differentiating between universities. Simply because otherwise, given the way we were writing the paper, it is more about trying to find a theoretical anchor where we can anchor our results on. And resources and dynamic capabilities is where we thought we could do. And definitely, it would have helped to actually try and see where the source of funding comes in and how the funding is allocated to differentiate the universities. It's something to think about. Federica and I will definitely have a think about it, and it is a very interesting question. I'll very quickly talk about the other ones, which are by Muthu and Dan, which I have already addressed. Yes, disciplinary focus is extremely important. Thank you very much for this. There will be some disciplines which do a lot of knowledge exchange, and there it would be interesting to see for those disciplines how their behavior has changed in terms of specialization of KE channels and stakeholders as the funding profile has changed. And it is some which we haven't thought about before, but it is definitely something we ought to look at. We just have to think about how we find this data, because this data is not easily found, unlike the HEPC data, which sort of captures everything at the organization level. But it's something that is definitely on the cards, something we will think about. Anything else in there? I'll just hold off for now and let others address, and then we can have another discussion.
I know we have a question from Alex, but I think I will let Andrea take the questions, and then I'll give you the.
Okay. Let me briefly say that there's a lot of scope for micro analysis here. Of course, our analysis is pretty aggregate, but suggests a lot of scope for micro project level analysis, which we didn't do. Just to go back to Grazia's question, nice to see you as well, Grazia. And there's nothing we can say, there's nothing which comes out from the data in terms of whether this shift from the private to public sector has got implications in terms of risky fundamental research. But there's a lot, but we can argue about it. I mean, actually, our discussion is precisely when we discuss about the implications of that shift in research is precisely pointing to what you are suggesting. So one could envisage, of course, it has to be further investigated, but you can envisage that the more you move toward the private sector, and then the more you have different dimensions of research in terms of how broad research is, how fundamental research is. You can think in terms of serendipity, for example, which becomes less relevant. So absolutely yes, I take your point. There's a lot of saying, a lot of investigate about what are the how this shift would change the nature itself of research which is being carried out. Thank you.
So Alex, do please.
Yeah. So I actually had a reflection on Abhijit's presentation, and I had a question on that. So if I understand correctly, it's summarized very, very briefly that when you see an increase in KE income in smaller institutions, you see an increase in specialization of a channel of managing change. But actually, could we reflect and could we consider, is that a reflection on the actual type of activity of what that KE funding support, which is very much more output driven than research income might be, for example, and so therefore you need specialization in order to deliver on those on that. So basically, what I'm trying to say is the increase in income come with some strings attached.
Actually, we have tried to look into this precise question, and you'll be very surprised to know where this specialization is coming from. This specialization is coming from mostly collaborative research and CPD. And this is, to me, this is inexplicable. I cannot figure out why this is happening. Maybe you can help. But what we are seeing is that as collaborative income share is going up in the total income portfolio, universities are becoming more and more specialized, as is CPD income, the same with CPD income. Whereas the others, we don't get to see much of an impact. So most of the specialization is being driven by collaborative research. Maybe because the collaborators want certain channels. So
that's really interesting, because we know there is lots of specialization in the commercialization of IP, for example, where you need critical mass and really specialized skills to actually be very effective at IP commercialization. So that's really interesting. Maybe we should follow that up, actually.
Yes, definitely. Something to follow up.
Thank you.
Anyone of course, there were a lot of discussion about disciplines, but I think these were addressed a little bit in the chat, so I didn't think that we should address the discussion around disciplines. I don't know if any of you want to say something further about this point on disciplines. Perhaps we have a couple of minutes to say something about that. Should we look at the discipline level? Is there anything else you want to say about that?
Federica, oh, sorry.
Mutu, yes, if you have a question.
Yes,
please.
thank you. No, in relation to, not the discipline, but in relation to what Abhijit and Alex were talking about, I was just wondering, it might be reverse causality, because when you have collaborative work, you are more likely to get a knowledge exchange funding that may result in you specializing more, because knowledge, as Alex was talking about, the knowledge exchange funding may be driven towards some specific forms of knowledge exchange channels. So it might be the case. Well, you can test.
If I can say something, I don't know. Is anybody on the line, Federica?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, can I? No, I mean, the problem, of course, of disciplines is very, very important. And we have got some information about that on both sides. The sides from industry on the one hand and the sides of universities on the other hand. In terms of industries, all the literature which shows the sources of innovation clearly indicates that there are, of course, obvious differences about that, which doesn't tell much from the discussion we have carried out today, namely what universities should do in order to improve the collaboration. But at least we know where people are, and we really appreciate that there are enormous variety of different things which firms ask to universities, and that often universities need to get prepared. For example, testing, whatever it is. Then the other side, which we are working on, as you know, when I'm not in London, I'm here at the Italian National Research Council, and we are an organization which, for example, has always been compared to the MIT, and to the MIT to show, of course, how poor we are compared to how good the MIT is. Even if in terms of endowment, we have got an endowment which is half of what the MIT has. And of course, in each of our branches, the approach is totally different. And the way, and there's no size which will fit all the branches or even all the institutes. And each of them has different income coming from industries, but also different collaborations or stories. The third point is about, since we know, shown by the work that many of you have done, Federica, Mutu, and so on, that one of the key contributions of universities is associated to the human resources we provide to the labor market. One of the typical issues which we are investigating at the moment is to see which share of the doctorate holders go to work in industry. So to what extent the doctorates, the doctoral students are just a production of academics through the means of academics, just to paraphrase Piero Sraffa, or they are also going to the real world. And again, you find quite a lot of differences, but I was surprised, for example, to discover that in a typical field of humanities, such as law, there are a lot of doctorate students which end up to be lawyers with a doctorate. And through visual and personal information, we have discovered that, of course, when a lawyer adds to its business card the title of doctorate, its bills will double. And therefore, this is strong.
I've got to stop you here because we are overrunning, and I just, sorry, Thank you so much. I just want to give our speakers a final chance to respond to the last comments before we close the session. So Abhijit or Daniel, or or Alex or Andrea, if you want to respond to the last few comments, please feel free. Otherwise, we had a really interesting conversation. I can see that people need to go now, so unfortunately we do need to wrap up. We have had a really, really productive exchange also in the chat. So I think some of the comments I'm going to go back to because some of them were really thought-provoking. So I thank our speaker very much for joining us today. I really appreciate that they've given some of their time to join this discussion. Thank you very much to our audience as well. Perhaps we can just join in a round of applause to our speakers and unmute our microphones for a second and say thank you very much.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to chat. I hope it was useful.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. It was a fantastic event. Really good. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will see you at one of the next CIMR panel sessions. I think the next one will be on green finance and innovation. Is that correct, Helen?
Yes, on June the 9th. So we hope people will be able to join us then. But today has been excellent. So thank you all the speakers and discussants. Thank you, Federica, for organising. And thank you, Ola, for facilitating all of this. Thank you, everybody.